So this month, Leica is holding their 20th annual Lights Photographica Auction, and this is something that they've done over the years. They've had some pretty interesting cameras in this auction. This year, they've got something that's kind of extra special. This camera is pretty much the star of the show. It is one of the earliest Leicas. This is a Leica O series that's referred to as 105. It's about as rare as a Leica can get, and it's expected to fetch an auction price somewhere between 2 million and 3 million euros. So the big question, it's obviously old and rare, but why is this valued so high? All right, so let's back up just a second if you're not familiar with the lineage of Leica cameras. So this is a camera that I own. This is the Leica 1A. It was not a $3 million camera. I paid about $1,600 for this, but it was the first production camera that Leica ever made. And so this one is very clean. It has a 5-digit serial number that dates this probably to around 1930. When you consider that this camera actually works, I have used it, and it's 92 years old. Talk about built to last. So the first time I ever saw one of these like up close and in person was years ago. So I was visiting Ralph Gibson's studio. He actually has one. And I asked him about it and he said, oh, the Leica 1A, that's the Leica in its purest form. That really got me thinking. I think this idea of camera in its purest form, it's probably the purest form of any camera made by any manufacturer in the history of photography. It's extremely simple. This has a fixed 50mm lens. This is before Leica started making interchangeable lenses. So the lens is collapsible. It collapses inside the body when you're not using it, so it could actually fit in a shirt pocket. And everything else on the camera is pretty much mechanically engineered, and it's really impressive that it all fits into this size. So you have a simple body. You've got the top plate that has a viewfinder and all of your dials on it. You have a bottom plate that's actually removable, and this is where you're going to load film into the camera. On the top plate, the controls are dead simple. You have a winder on the left-hand side. You have a viewfinder next to that. There is a cold shoe for putting a rangefinder in. This does not have any kind of focus mechanism. It's all manual. You've got the shutter release, and then you've got the winder and film release lever, and that's about it. Everything on here is completely mechanical. So in terms of exposure, you're going to have to understand how to expose in the lighting conditions you're in. And in terms of focus, well, this is where it gets really interesting. On the front of the camera, you've got your hockey stick, is what they call it. It's a focus lock at infinity. So if you want to unlock that, you press that down, move the lever, and everything is in meters, so you can just estimate the distance. They did make accessory rangefinders that you could put in the cold shoe. I don't have one on this camera, but that would allow you to at least get a focus distance. This is an f3.5 lens, but actually using it just with complete manual focus isn't that hard. You just use the concept of f8 and B there. That's going to give you enough depth of field to get whatever it is in focus, and then you can kind of guesstimate how far it is away from you. So this is the first model that Leica produced. They started making these in 1925, and the story leading up to how this came to be is actually pretty interesting. So it starts with this guy, Oskar Barnack. He was a photographer who worked at Lights as an engineer. He loved to shoot, but he also suffered from asthma. So back in the early 20th century, cameras were much larger due to the film sizes. So he had this brilliant idea for this small portable camera that still produced a high quality image. So his idea was to take 35mm movie film, flip it vertically to maximize the image area. And so what he ended up with was a 24 by 36mm image size in the famous 2:3 aspect ratio. This is exactly what we see today in what we call full frame cameras. So he started this project in 1913, and by 1924 he had talked Lights into producing the Leica camera. And so Leica is a combination of Lights plus camera, coming out with Leica. So this is the very first image made with a Leica. It was shot by Oskar himself in 1913. It's in Wetzlar, where Leica are still headquartered today. This is a building in the Eisenmarkt, so it's still there today and looks pretty much like it did in 1913. There's a marker, so you can actually go shoot in the same spot. I did this myself when I was in Wetzlar last year, and it's a pretty cool experience to be able to kind of go where the very first 35mm was born. Oskar Barnack was a pretty decent photographer himself. There's a series of images that were made during a flood in Wetzlar, and this is very significant as he literally established the format that has become one of the most popular in the history of photography. This is essentially full frame, as I mentioned. It's the same format and aspect ratio used on what we have today with digital cameras. Okay, so back to our $3 million camera. So this is an O series Leica. 22 of these were produced in 1923, and they were made to sort of test the market a little bit before the first cameras were produced commercially. so only about 12 of these survive today. This one, however, is extra special in that number 105 here was Oskar Barnack's personal camera. It's got his initials OB engraved on the camera, and it comes with an extremely detailed provenance, proving the history of its ownership. So this was Oskar's personal camera until about 1930. That was when he switched over to using interchangeable lens Leicas. He used a Model 1C. He gave this camera to his son. A collector bought the camera in 1960, and so this comes with numerous documents, letters. Last fall, I actually got to go to Wetzlar. We were doing some stuff when Ralph Gibson was introduced into the Hall of Fame. They actually had this camera on display, and I got to see it. They also had these small books that were produced on 105, and they gave these out as gifts. I have one. It's pretty incredible. This is a really interesting camera. It was Barnack's personal camera. This is just about as rare as it gets. In fact, this camera, which is expected to close at the end of the auction around $3 million, is very comparable to the price of photographic works of art. I'll give you a couple examples. In 2011, Cindy Sherman's Untitled number 96 was auctioned at just under $4 million. Andreas Gursky's Rhine 2 was sold for $4,338,500. And literally just a few weeks ago, Man Ray's Le Violon d'Inglés broke the record for the most expensive photograph ever sold at $12.4 million. It sure would be nice to be the owner of one of these when it's auctioned off, but it's extremely expensive to get into owning works of art or even rare cameras, and you've got to get in really early. So I could start combing the estate sales and waiting for the next rare deal, or I could check out our sponsor this week, who are the awesome folks over at Masterworks.com. Masterworks is a first-of-its-kind platform making multi-million-dollar paintings investable through this concept called fractional ownership. In other words, you can invest in a work of art without actually having to put up the money to buy the entire thing yourself. Since 2017, Masterworks has successfully offered and sold 2 paintings, with each one of them realizing a net annualized gain above 30% per work. And they're consistently adding new offerings on their website, so who knows, if you get in at the right time, maybe they'll have a Man Ray available. So if you want to check them out, they're giving my subscribers right now priority access to skip their wait list. So all you have to do is check out the link in the description of this video, and you can join over 350,000 other members already on the platform. This is a really interesting investment concept, and this ideal of fractional ownership where you can own essentially shares in a work of art. Definitely worth checking out, and I want to give a special shout out and thanks to the awesome folks over at Masterworks for sponsoring this video. So I wanted to do this video today not because mortals like you and me are going to go out and buy a $3 million historical camera, but I do want to mention it because of the historical significance. And this is fascinating to me because this is a historical significance that is still in play with Leica today. They have literally run their entire company for 100 years now off of this basic concept that Oskar Barnack came up with. Like I mentioned, the 1A, and this evolved later into, well, what if we were able to change the lens out? So we have interchangeable lenses, which introduced what we call Leica thread mount or LTM mount. So that was a screw mount type thing. You had Canon and Nikon who came along and built rangefinders that were very similar to the Leica. They moved on to other things. Leica ended up going with what we call M mount after that, which is really still in play today. We had the M series film cameras. By the M8, we'd switched over to digital. Today we've got the M11. It's all the same concept of a portable camera with extremely high image quality, and there's some other benefits that you get out of this as well. And if we go back to this idea of portability, the 35mm camera completely changed the history of photography, because now we could put cameras into situations and places where they wouldn't have been appropriate before, or they would have been too much to set up the tripod and actually get everything set. And so the delay in time of getting shots, like 35mm, just changed all of that. And this camera completely overhauled photojournalism and what was possible during the age of things like Life magazine. Henri Cartier-Bresson used a Leica, probably one of the most famous Leica users. But there was also Robert Capa, Bruce Davidson, Nick Utt, Lee Freelander, Ernst Haas, William Klein, Joseph Kudelka, W. Eugene Smith, and the nature of this camera also extended over into art and street photography. Photographers such as William Eggleston, I mentioned Ralph Gibson earlier, Elliot Erwitt, Andre Kertész, Sebastião Salgado, Marc Ribot, Gary Winogrand. I mean, this list starts to include some of the most famous photographers in the history of the medium. Oskar Barnack's vision was the real deal, and it completely overhauled this idea of documentary types of photography. I think a lot of that has to do with the size. I mean, sure, the image quality is there, but when when I go shoot on my Leica, there's a big difference in having a very small camera that you're using compared to like if you bust out the Nikon Z9 or something and then all of a sudden everyone around you becomes very camera aware, starts acting differently. It's just not the same. I also think that's one of the reasons that I still prefer the 50mm lens today. That was actually part of Barnack's vision too. Whether or not you like the focal length of 50mm or you're comfortable shooting at that, as Ralph Gibson says, you cannot deny how many famous photographs in the history of photography have been made with a 50mm lens. So I wanted to make a video today on an extraordinarily expensive camera, not so much because it's an expensive camera, but I also wanted to talk about the history and the legacy that Leica have in the history of that company that leads up into what we have today. It literally changed photography and it had an impact on everyone in every camera that we use today. Anyway, I'll probably update you when the auction closes. I believe it's June 11th, and it'll be interesting to see what this camera actually goes for in the end. It may even exceed $3 million, who knows. But if you have any questions, drop them in the comments. I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.